Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. In this video I figured I would just take a look at the most recent polls both nationally and each state poll, as well as Donald Trump's approval rating polls, just to look at the general trends and the general direction that this election is heading. Now obviously if 2016 taught us anything, it's not to solely depend on the polls. However, it is worth noting that the polls do represent accurately the trend and the overall direction that the election is heading, so it's worth taking a look at the most recent polls. So currently, the national polling difference has Joe Biden with a 7.3 percentage point lead over Donald Trump. This is a very significant lead, especially what it was back before coronavirus hit, back before the protests and civil unrest hit. The difference was only about 4 points. And then as the coronavirus pandemic hit, you see the difference starting to grow as Donald Trump's approval rating dropped, and then the protests started. And Joe Biden's lead peaked in mid-July, mid-June at about 9.6. And then eventually it started to narrow as coronavirus in the US started to ease a little bit, relatively for the country. And then as we move along, you can see Biden got a little bit of a DNC bump over here, peaking at 9.3, and then it quickly reset, and Donald Trump was able to also receive a convention bump, and his bump brought him to about 7 points as the difference in the national total. And over the past couple weeks, it stalled at about 7.5, currently stands at 7.3 as the difference. So if we take a look at the most recent polls, you can see two Fox News polls has Biden with a 5-point lead over Donald Trump. Now, if you think Fox News, generally a conservative source, that's not always the case with its polling. The Fox News television channel with its late night hosts is generally conservative, but the polls are usually pretty accurate, so a 5-point lead is something to take a good look at. You can also look at these USC Dornsife polls. Currently have Biden up 14 and 12, and that's the general trend with these polls. 15 and 12 here, 15 and 12. These are polls that generally have Biden by up by double digits. You can also see two A-plus rated polls by 538 have Biden up 7 and Biden up 9. So the general consensus of these polls is Biden holds a significant lead. If we go over to the state polls, the key battleground states, I'll begin with Arizona. Arizona is slowly creeping its way away from Donald Trump. You can see a couple polls here have brought it closer, but the general direction is to Biden, and that's why we classify it as a lean to the Democrat. Florida is a state that's really narrowed. Back in June, the difference was 7.3, 7.4, and it's currently about 2.5. There have been some polls that have come out very close. Even Marist College had a poll with the election even, and even Trump leading in Florida. So this is something very, very close to look at. You can see a lot of the polls have it extremely close. This is going to be a very interesting state to look at in Florida as Trump diminishes Biden's lead in this state. If we go over to Michigan, Michigan is a state that Biden was up almost 11 points earlier in mid-June. This was at the peak of the coronavirus and the civil unrest, and that's when we saw the largest national polling lead, and that resembles the same in the states as Michigan's lead was 10.7 here for Joe Biden, and it's currently at 7.6. The recent polls have suggested that this isn't going to change much. Biden still holds a substantial lead in most of these polls, and that leads us to believe that Michigan will be going for Joe Biden. Nevada is a state that has been narrowing. I still classify it as lean to Joe Biden, but it's a state that is also interesting to look at as Hillary Clinton was able to win it in 2016. But as you can see, it's getting very close as of late. A few polls have had it within 4 to 5 points, and that's a good place to be if you're Donald Trump and trying to narrow that lead. Pennsylvania is another key battleground state. We have 538 currently has the difference as a 5-point lead for Joe Biden. These are two polls that have been very good for Joe Biden. This, again, if you remember, in Florida, Marist College had Florida even and even Trump up 1 in the state of Florida. But for Pennsylvania, they have Biden with a pretty large lead. So that's something to look at, as the same polling source has Trump winning in Florida and then has Biden up big in Pennsylvania. So that's something to look at there. We'll finish it off. I guess we'll take a quick look at Texas, as that has been a very large conversation for this election, as many think that it could flip. Currently, Trump holds a 1-point lead in the state of Florida. Most of the polls have had it very close, going back and forth between Trump and Biden. Currently, President Trump is up 1. And finally, we'll end with Wisconsin. Wisconsin, just like all the other states, have started to narrow slowly, not at the pace that you would like if you're Donald Trump, but it's currently at 6.5, so not as wide, as big a difference as Michigan, but also a bigger difference than Pennsylvania and Florida if you're looking for perspective. The general consensus here is that Biden is up about 5 to 7 points in the polls. Now, obviously, things could change, as Wisconsin on Election Day on 2016, I believe Hillary was up 8 points in the polls, and obviously we know that Trump was able to win the state of Wisconsin, so especially for a state like this, you don't really want to look at the polls as the final source and the final say for what is going to happen. And finally, I think it's worth looking at Donald Trump's approval rating. He peaked at about 45.8% approval rating. This was late March, early February, and then as things started to get worse in the country and the overall trend went down, his approval rating dropped all the way to 40, and it slowly began to creep its way back up at 43.5 was what it was a couple weeks ago, and then as things have started to get worse again, and the newly released comments that Trump made about the military has dropped his approval rating just a little bit down to 42.5, and it's creeped its way back up to 43. Now, I think this is worth noting because if we compare it to the past presidents, you can see Trump is just under Barack Obama, under George W. Bush, under Bill Clinton, and if you look at it, the only presidents that he is currently beating at this time in the presidency is George H.W. Bush and Jimmy Carter of the recent presidents, and those are the only two presidents that didn't get reelected. So all the other presidents that Trump is falling behind in his approval rating at this point in his presidency, the ones that are ahead of him got reelected, and the ones that he is actually doing better than at this point did not get reelected. So I think it's worth keeping an eye on where his approval rating goes. If it continues to follow this direction, you can see the prediction. If it does continue to follow this direction, it'll be interesting to see what Donald Trump's approval rating would need to be for him to get reelected. So that's the general direction that the polls have had. Currently a 7.3 lead for Joe Biden. This is a good place to be if you are the Democrats, because it has seemed to have stalled lately. I do think the polls are going to narrow a little bit, but currently it's not going at a well enough pace for Donald Trump to feel necessarily confident about the election. However, the state polls being very close, specifically Florida and Pennsylvania, are two key states to his reelection. Those are definitely states to keep an eye on. Even if Biden wins the popular vote by 4 or 5%, Trump could win a state like Florida, and if it gets even closer nationally, he could be able to keep the state of Pennsylvania, and that would be enough to make it a very close race and potentially have it be a tie, which is what we currently predict the election will end up as. So that is the direction that the polls have the election going. Again, like I said, if 2016 taught us anything, you don't want to look at the polls necessarily as the end factor of your decision or your prediction, but it's good to look at the overall trend that the election is heading. So thank you for watching. If you liked the video, please like it and subscribe, and make sure you check out our latest prediction videos.